John M. Blades, Executive Director of the Flagler Museum. After a career spanning more than 20 years at another of America's best-known Gilded Age historic house museums, Hearst Castle in San Simeon, California, John Blades was appointed Executive Director of the Henry Morrison Flagler Museum in 1995. Since then, he's developed all of the museum's policies, procedures, and forms, from a mission statement to a collections policy, and completely revamped the museum's operation. He's overseen improvements to the facility, including state-of-the-art climate control system, the replacement of a 40,000 square foot roof, the installation of a new electrical system, the construction of a new visitor parking lot, the installation of new admission kiosks, the construction of a new museum store, the construction of a new Flagler Keenan Pavilion, the rebuilding of Whitehall's dock, the restoration of the seawall, the installation of a new elevator, research library, and additional staff offices. He's also supervised the creation of a new website, a new docent program, new event policies, and a new series of award-winning museum publications. Blades oversaw an extensive series of conservation and restoration projects completed for Whitehall Centennial in 2002. These projects included the restoration of a 1,000-foot historic fence and the complete restoration of Whitehall's interiors, including reproductions of historic wallpapers. Blades is a graduate of the Getty Trust Museum Management Institute and has served as the chairman of both the Cultural Executives Committee and the Long Range Cultural Planning Committee of the Palm Beach County Cultural Council. For the American Association of Museums, he served as the treasurer and secretary of the Historic House Museum's Professional Interest Council, was a member of the 2000 Programming Committee, a reviewer for the Museum Assessment Program, and a surveyor for Accreditation Review. He's reviewed grants for general operating support and museum leadership for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and also for the Florida Division of Cultural Resources Cultural Institutions Program and the Division of Historical Resources Grants and Aid Program. In addition, he served as Vice President of the Palm Beach Chamber of Commerce and Advisory Board of Governors for the Historical Society of Palm Beach County, President of the Florida Art Museum Directors Association, and board member of the Florida Association of Museums. And he has a fantastic presentation for you all. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Blades.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I guess it's only fitting, if you're going to hear a lecture on Titanic, that the lecturer be able to walk on water. So I hope you are thoroughly convinced I can do that. You notice they didn't give me a lot of water to drown in here, so I'm going to set that aside so it's not a distraction. Thank you for having me here today. I love the Science Museum. I think what Lou Crampton and his team have done here in the last couple of years in particular is really spectacular. So I'm here to talk about, what I was asked to talk about is the context of the Titanic. You've got a great exhibit next door. I hope you'll all take time to see. But what was the world like when the Titanic was built and when it met its fate? I'm going to have to move back and forth here between my slides and my glasses and trying to look up every now and then so you know I know you're out there even though I can't see you with the bright light shining in my eyes. You know, the world that produced the Titanic is what we call at the Flagler Museum the Gilded Age. But it was really also a Titanic world. It was very much a world of Titanic thinkers, Titanic doers, and Titanic struggles. And that's what I hope to illustrate for you today in this talk. Let's talk a little bit about some of the titans of America's Gilded Age, or the world in which the Titanic came to be. And their names that I'm only going to cover a couple of dozen names. We could probably do several dozen, but you're going to recognize these people because even 100 years later, they're so much a part of our American culture that you see their names on businesses, on all kinds of things. They were just people we still remember, unlike probably the people living today. I doubt we're going to be able to remember 24 of the people living today 100 years from now. But certainly that's the case for these people because they're so much a part of how our modern American society was created. The first upper left-hand corner is St. Gaudens, America's greatest sculptor. You're probably familiar with the Walking Liberty double eagle, the most beautiful coin America's ever minted, and a great many monuments around the country designed by St. Gaudens. The gentleman next to him is a guy named Gale Ferris. All of us go to county fairs and midways, and there's always a Ferris wheel. Gale Ferris was the designer of that device, which was, for its time, truly amazing. His wheel, by the way, stood 265 feet tall, and the cars were the size of rail cars. So the cars held 60 people, not just a couple of people. Truly an amazing thing, featured first in Chicago in 1893. Next to him, and I tried to use younger photographs so that you see these men more as they appeared when they made their fame and fortune. But next to him is a gentleman named Andrew Carnegie. Almost 3,000 libraries across the country bore his name, and a great many other things as well. Lower left-hand corner, a guy named Henry Morrison Flagler, somebody those of us who live locally should know well, the man who literally invented modern Florida. Next to him is a man named Henry Clay Frick, someone who admired Flagler so much he kept a photo portrait of Flagler in his office. And next to him is a guy named Milton Hershey, responsible for a lot of trips to the dentist, I'm sure. He somehow figured out how to make milk chocolate sweet and desirable, and hooked us all on chocolate. Upper left-hand corner, a guy named Nikola Tesla. What do we know Tesla for? Not for automobiles, which bear his name today, but for alternating current, and for a great many patents that made alternating current and alternating motor possible. Those patents were bought by a guy named George Westinghouse and turned into commercial products. Next to him, Mark Twain, America's greatest writer and humorist. Next to him, I'm sorry, the man next to him, I've forgotten who he is, so we'll come back to him if I can think of it later. But on the lower left-hand corner, a gentleman named Richard Morris Hunt designed the Biltmore and a great many wonderful buildings throughout America. He was America's foremost architect at the time, the elder statesman of architecture. Next to him, a guy named Charles Follen McKim. He got the job to take over the project and actually finish our national capital, Washington, D.C. So he was the lead architect in the late 19th century to finish up the Capitol and make it look like what it looks today. And next to him is one of his partners, a guy named Stanford White. I wish these photographs were in color because Stanford White had bright red hair, and that was a big old bright red mustache he bears there. But he was as much a character as he looks to be. Huge impact on interior design, art collecting, and building design. In the next panel, in the upper left-hand corner, we have a guy named Daniel Chester French. He designed the Lincoln that's sitting in the Lincoln Memorial, for example. Another great American sculptor. A lot of his work adorns the monuments all over our nation. And next to him, the Wright brothers, of course, who figured out how to do a flying machine. A couple of bicycle mechanics who were just hard at it and finally figured out how to create an airplane heavier than air flying machine. And next to them, a guy named Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, well, we all do texting now, I guess, or at least our kids do, but telephones ruled for more than a century. We all carry around versions of telephone these days, but it seems like we use them for everything but actually talking on the telephone. And then lower left-hand corner, Albert Einstein, 1908, he developed his theory of relativity. He really changed the world of science. I bet most of us didn't realize he developed that theory so early on, but right around the time of the Titanic. And then next to him, Madame Curie, she figured out X-radiation, received a Nobel Prize for her work. And next to her, Teddy Roosevelt, the only president in this group. Bigger than life. All these people were bigger than life. These are titanic figures, and certainly Teddy Roosevelt qualifies. I love this picture because he's looking back at the camera. His sight was so poor, he's probably just trying to see what the photographer was doing, but he looks like he's ready to jump off the screen at you. And then upper left-hand corner, John Davidson Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest men in America. And next to him, another wealthy man, a man named J.P. Morgan, who functioned as America's central bank in 1907 when we had a terrible panic and there wasn't a central bank to sort of regulate the money flow. He stepped in and made that possible with the help of fellow bankers. Next to him, a guy named Thomas Edison. All kinds of things Edison invented. I liked Edison's remark that opportunity comes dressed in overalls and looks like work. He was a hard worker, practically lived in his laboratory trying to figure things out and come up with new inventions. Below that, a guy named Henry Ford made automobiles accessible to everyone about the time of the Titanic by making them affordable and mass producing them. And next to him, a gentleman you probably don't recognize here, but that's George Westinghouse. George Westinghouse revolutionized how trains worked, and trains were the 19th century, the most sophisticated form of technology really in the 19th century, and the biggest corporations were railroad corporations of that time. Invention after invention that made trains more practical, safer, and more efficient. And then next to him, a guy named Gustav Eiffel. We know about Gustav Eiffel, right? Eiffel Tower, but also a great engineer in many other ways, and many projects are attributed to Gustav Eiffel. And then our last panel here, our roundup of about 24 titans of America's Gilded Age. Up in the upper left-hand corner, William Randolph Hearst, who really knew how to work the media, magazines, newspapers nationwide, made him a fortune. And next to him, Andrew Mellon, a treasurer under 3 presidents, and the gentleman who gave America the National Gallery. And next to him, a guy named Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted, Central Park, a great many other designs throughout America, including the Biltmore Estates and Grounds. And his firm is really responsible for starting the City Beautiful movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that really affected city planning and city layout from then on. Lower left-hand corner, a guy named Leland Stanford, one of the great universities today. By the way, he built that university because his son was killed on a trip around the world as part of his education. And to memorialize his son, he decided to build a university. One of the big 4, by the way, that helped create the Transcontinental Railroad. So that was Huntington, Stanford, Crocker, and Mark Hopkins. All Westerners. Didn't start out Westerners, they moved west. Then next to him is a guy named Collis P. Huntington, known now for the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, but one of the big 4 railroad magnates from the late 19th century. And then next to him is a guy named Thomas Hastings, and you should recognize him because Thomas Hastings was one of the architects for Whitehall. He was the architect for the Hotel Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine, the Hotel Alcazar, the Memorial Church in St. Augustine, the Presbyterian Church, I think it's the Presbyterian Church, 2 churches there, and the New York Public Library, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, and on and on and on. One of only 4 American architects to receive a gold medal from the Royal Institute of British Architects because they so admired his work, but not as well known today as he really should be. Technology was driving this period in a really big way. This is a early photograph of the Patent Office. And from 1863, when the old Patent Office burned and they lost all of their models and records, to 1911, there were more than 1 million patents filed. It got to the point where people thought, gosh, there can't be much more left to invent. When was the first wireless telephone invented and operating? Can anybody tell me? About 1886 in Kansas, if you can believe such a thing. So the 20th century, the later part of the 20th century, the part of the 20th century we all grew up in, was really a period of taking all of these inventions from the late 19th and early 20th century and turning them into consumer products. Most of the technology had already been created and patented, but hadn't really been turned into consumer products. That's what we saw happen in the second half of the 20th century. So let's talk about some of that technology. Gee, here's the USS Birmingham. This was the first plane was launched from its deck. So in a sense, the first aircraft carrier in 1910. In fact, here's a picture of the plane being launched from the deck. Doesn't look much like a fighter pilot, though, does it? It looks more like a gnat or a mosquito or something taking off the deck. Washing machines. Now, electric washing machines were invented around this time. These are early Maytag models from about 1914, I think. They still made them out of hooped tubs. but they had an electric agitator in them and an electric wringer, and they were starting to make people's lives easier, free them up to do a little more than just get by. Early vacuum cleaner, this is one from 1908. Look at that thing. And here's a fax machine from 1913. Now, fax machines go back well into the 19th century, but by the early 20th century, they started to become practical, and you could actually start to send images via fax machines. And of course, automobile racing. Here's an Indianapolis Speedway photograph. It would open in 1909. Automobiles had become faster and more durable, and so racing, which really started here in Ormond Beach, here in Florida, not just a few years earlier than this, had really developed very quickly. Outboard motors, something very important to Florida fishermen. This is one of the very earliest outboard motors called a Hiawatha from 1914. There are very few of these that have survived. This one's been beautifully restored. Traffic signals. Cars were becoming so common with Ford making them much more affordable and accessible that traffic signals came along pretty quickly because they could go fast enough to really have a bad accident. First traffic signals just flipped around, as you can see, to say proceed or stop. No warning in between, no yellow light, no slow down or get ready to stop. And look, this is the first home in America. This is 1912, built for Charles Gates, who made a fortune in barbed wire, which was something really necessary out west, and they sold millions and millions of feet of barbed wire. It was the first home in America that was air conditioned. 1912, the year of the Titanic. By the way, that home's in Milwaukee. Should have been in Florida, I would think. Milwaukee, they only need the air conditioning, 5 months a year, maybe? 6 months. The first neon signs appeared in 1910 at the Paris Auto Show. Here's a poster from that show. And fashion was affected as well. So technology entered into fashion as well. Here's an early photograph of a brassiere, 1900. These started to replace other foundation garments and become popular. And permanent wave. Look at that thing. The inventor of the permanent wave, Carl Nessler, used his wife as his subject for experiments and burned her hair off twice completely before he figured out how to make a machine that wouldn't burn people's hair off. But look at how crazy that thing is. So I think by showing you some of these images and giving you some of these dates, you get the sense that technology really, Americans and the world had a huge fascination with technology, and really a strong belief that technology was going to really free us up to do whatever we really should be doing with our time, our higher and better purposes, and that no problem was probably beyond the solution of technology. So with that in mind, something like building a ship as large as the Titanic and naming it, of all things, the Titanic, which is a pretty bold thing to do, makes a lot more sense, I think, in the context of the kind of technology we've looked at in just the last few minutes. It was also an age of monuments. Just a few years before the Titanic came along, we erected the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France, and we'd finally finished up the George Washington Monument. You know what sits on top of that monument, by the way? 1 pound of pure aluminum. A little pyramid of pure aluminum that's engraved sits on at the very peak of that, because aluminum, at the time the monument was finished, was more expensive than platinum or gold or silver or any other precious metal. We didn't have any way of extracting aluminum, one of the most common metals in our Earth's crust. We didn't have any expensive way to extract it, so it was really a precious metal for most of the 19th century. Today, we think nothing of it. It's everywhere. And the Lincoln Memorial was under construction. This is a picture from 1911. Our Capitol really didn't come into its current sort of form until well into the 1920s, maybe even the 1940s. 1943 was when the Jefferson Memorial was completed. Conceived much earlier, but it took a long time for Congress to fund some of these things and to figure out how to do them. This is also about the time the Japanese gave us a couple of thousand cherry trees to plant at the Capitol. The first 2,000 were so diseased we had to burn them. They were a little embarrassed, so they went back and worked on some grafting to some more healthy rootstock and sent us 3,000 trees a couple of years later. and Mrs. Taft oversaw the planting of the cherry trees at the Capitol that we like so much now. Sports. Sports is a whole different world back in those days. This is a picture of what I think of and what a book has been read about called The Real All-Americans. These are players. These are Native American boys playing for the Carlisle School. How many of you heard of Captain Pratt? Captain Pratt ran the incarceration at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, where we took all the Indian chiefs and troublemakers and locked them up for years. And in St. Augustine, Captain Pratt oversaw that. But he decided there was a better way eventually. He opened a school in the middle of Pennsylvania he called the Carlisle School, and the chiefs around the country sent their kids to learn how to be white culturally, to be the dominant culture. And they turned out to be great football players. They weren't big, but they were just tough. They just didn't seem to care if they got knocked down, hurt, or broken bones, whatever it was, they'd play. And they had a very inspiring coach, a guy named Pop Warner, coached them. A young man named Jim Thorpe tried to join the team, couldn't make it the first couple of years because he wasn't deemed tough enough, surprisingly enough. Excuse me, and these guys went on to defeat just about everybody. In fact, it got so that the Ivy League schools wouldn't play them. They didn't want to be defeated by guys half their size, who were just tougher and meaner. But to overcome their size issue, they developed the forward pass. It also helped reduce the number of deaths in college football. There were dozens of young men killed every year playing football in those days. They didn't have the pads and helmets that we have today. So much more dangerous sport. In fact, they went on to play West Point, and Thorpe, who did eventually make the team, played across from a linebacker named Dwight Eisenhower. Bicycles were everywhere. Manhattan, by the way, went into a craze in the 1880s with bicycles because, not to be too crude about it, but horses used throughout Manhattan in those days, there's a problem. They leave things behind. And there were snowdrifts of horse manure that would pile up. I mean, they really got 8, 10 feet high as they were shoved aside. Bicycles were the answer to that. And if you could, I couldn't find a picture, but if there are pictures of Manhattan that look more like Beijing in the 1980s. Bicycles everywhere because it freed up women. Women could ride bicycles, by the way. They were somewhat affordable, and they were easy to maneuver, and they were extremely popular. So this is a picture of a bicycle club in Manhattan. And this is a picture of maybe the most famous athlete in the world at the time of the Titanic, a guy named Major Taylor. Major Taylor won every race there was to win in bicycles. There were velodromes in those days. Even in Manhattan had a velodrome, so you could go see bicycle racing. It was one of the great spectator sports at the time. And Major Taylor, an unlikely person to be, because being black and considering the position of blacks in the country at that time, it's unlikely he would become the most famous athlete in the world, but he did. He raced all over the world. An amazing character. And you can see bicycles by this point had evolved to pretty much the look they have today. This is a Puck cartoon from the period. Sports are so big and so important to national identity that there are dozens and dozens of cartoons, Puck cartoons in this time, showing John Bull, you can see him to the left, and good old Uncle Sam to the right. Now, if you look closely, Uncle Sam's, what's he got in his right arm? He's got the 100 Guinea Cup, he's got the America's Cup. By the way, the biggest international spectator sport of the time was yacht racing. It was the America's Cup race was the most popular international spectator sport, if you could imagine that. And he's got the America's Cup. He's got all kinds of medals for every other kind of sport you can think of. And John Bull's looking sort of like, darn. Why, he's got that guy under his arm. That's Thomas Lipton. Lipton, who competed 5 times for the America's Cup in 5 different versions of a ship he called Shamrock and lost every time, was labeled America's greatest, what do they call him? America's greatest sportsman, in that actually they call him the greatest loser. But the New York Yacht Club felt so bad for him after 5 campaigns, they had a gold trophy made for him and presented to him by the mayor of New York, a guy named Jimmy Walker, and the mayor of Boston, a guy named Honey Fitz, him from the Kennedy family, and a book signed by everybody who contributed. The kids all over the country contributed pennies to make this, to have Tiffany's make this cup for him as a consolation prize, because they called him the gamest loser in the world. He kept a great attitude, wildly popular, and of course we still know him for his Lipton tea. But America was taking the world in sports at this time. This is an early photograph of the Buddy Bolden Band in 1905. They were developing a kind of music that by 1910 in New Orleans was being called jazz, a pure American form of music. And of course, it's about this time, this is a 1920 cover of sheet music for something called the Dallas Blues. Blues came out of jazz at about this same time. Of course, there were explorers trying to conquer all kinds of things. This is Robert Peary in 1909 as he reaches the North Pole. Those are flags of all kind of crazy flags. Flags that meant something to him. One's of the Navy League, one's of his fraternity at Bowdoin College. One's something he called the Polar Flag. Another one's something he called the DAR Flag of Peace, and nobody knows what that really is. The DAR says, well, yeah, it sort of belongs to us, but we really don't have that flag. And then finally, the one flag we can probably all identify with, a Red Cross flag. This is Roald Amundsen, who reached the South Pole in 1911. And we had 3 states join the Union about this time. Oklahoma, the territory of Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And in 1912, New Mexico, and then finally, Arizona finished out the lower 48. So the 48 states remained the 48 states from 1912 through, 1950, who can remember, 52, 54? 58 was it? I think it was actually later, yeah, 58 when Alaska and Hawaii joined the Union. By the way, during the Gilded Age, we went from about 24 states to 48 states. So our country was growing by leaps and bounds. There were actually 20 different versions of the flag that flew over this country during Henry Flagler's life, for example. Taft was running for office again. He was preparing for the upcoming election at the time of the Titanic. He was running against Roosevelt, who'd already been president, but decided to form a third party, a progressive party called the Bull Moose Party. And he was running against Democrat Woodrow Wilson and socialist Eugene Debs, sort of a labor party. The Republican vote got split, much as it did when Ross Perot ran and upset George Bush the Elder. But what's most amazing, I think, about this election was that 5% of the vote went to the Socialist Party. It was the largest vote the Socialist Party would ever receive, and a substantial part of the vote. Wilson won, but with only just over 40% of the popular vote. So not a majority by any means, but the Electoral College, he won in the Electoral College by a landslide, eventually. This is Teddy Roosevelt. He had been Secretary of the Navy, and under his direction, something called the Great White Fleet was created. America was becoming a world power. He knew we needed a Navy. He promoted that. And here's one of the ships, hulls painted white, the reason they were called the Great White Fleet, that would make us a world power. In fact, under his leadership, we just sort of took over all kinds of things like Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Cuba, and in fact we ended up with 5 territories, some of which we gave back. And then of course, since he thought, and I think maybe justifiably thought, that only America was going to end up building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, he basically took a little chunk of Colombia away and called it Panama, and then we could build our canal. But this is a nice political cartoon of TR looking down the barrel of a cannon at some little Central American who's got a giant sword but is no match for that cannon for sure. In fact, I love this political cartoon. Here he is with his Great White Fleet just circling around the Caribbean. Okay, we'll take whatever we want and do what we need to do. Well, we did, of course, build the Panama Canal. We announced that in 1905. We completed it by 1915. A great, massive engineering project of the day. Well, we had a lot of trouble with our economy, too. In those days, there wasn't a central bank. Jackson had killed the central bank. He didn't trust them. He and Jefferson both killed national or central banks during their tenures because they didn't trust financiers, bankers. And so when we lurched from recession to recession, or as they called them in those days, panics, they could be pretty severe. This is a cartoon from the Panic of 1907, which was brought on by, guess what? Derivative products out of places called bucket shops. And so we passed legislation after that panic to make derivative products illegal, and that legislation stayed in place until 2000, when the Clinton administration, with the advice of Alan Greenspan, said, you know, our financial system doesn't need this law anymore. It's self-regulating, we're more enlightened, we can repeal that. And so the, what they call it, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000 repealed the bucket shop laws, or the laws against derivative products, and we all know what happened next. This is J.P. Morgan. He's the guy who saved us from the panic. He called everybody into his office in his library in Manhattan, the other bankers, I should say, sort of locked the doors and said, boys, if we're going to save the country, it's going to be up to us. And you're not leaving this room until I can get a commitment from each of you to basically fund or guarantee funding in place of a national bank or a central bank or the Fed, as we would later call it. And he was a hero in this country in 1907. By the time of the Titanic, he was a villain again. We're pretty fickle in our country about who's a hero and a villain from moment to moment. There were huge labor struggles in this country. As an example, this is a photograph of the Los Angeles Times building, and it was bombed in 1910. About 22 or 3 people lost their lives in that bombing. They brought in, the Chamber of Commerce decided, we've got to get somebody working on this. So they got together with the commissioners, the city commissioners, and they brought in this guy, a guy named William J. Burns, or Willie Burns as they called him. And he was America's greatest detective. Another photograph I wish was in color, because he also had bright red hair, just like Stanford White. But he was incredible as a detective. So incredible that within a few months, he figured the whole thing out and had an airtight case against these two, James and John McNamara. They were the head of the Iron Workers Union, based in Indiana. And between 1906 and 1911, they had planned and executed 110 bombings across the country. So we don't realize how much turmoil there was, how much struggle there was for what kind of economy, what kind of system we were going to have in this country. But this was a time of titanic struggles to figure out whether capitalism was the way we were going to work, or whether it's going to be anarchy or socialism or some other form of government. And these guys thought that it should be about socialism, and the labor unions should drive the government. And so they were willing to plant bombs to prove it. So the case was super airtight, so airtight, in fact, they really didn't stand a chance. They couldn't do anything but admit they were guilty. They then just argued that they were justified. And this is a famous writer named Lincoln Steffens, who argued that it was justifiable dynamiting because they weren't being treated fairly by the capitalists, the business owners. This is Samuel Gompers of the AFL at the time, before they merged with the CIO. And he fanned the flames of these riots across the country. We had them in Chicago, we had them in Pennsylvania Railroad. They were massive riots that did massive amounts of damage at the time. And of course, Eugene Debs was a part of this as well. He was head of the Wobblies at the time. They all came to California for this trial because it was such a big deal. And of course, who did they get as their attorney? A guy named Clarence Darrow, who knew he had no case except to argue that this was justified. Well, he got caught jury tampering. Now, I don't know about you, but in school I learned Clarence Darrow was a hero. But in fact, Clarence Darrow was run out of California. They only didn't put him in jail because he promised never to set foot in California again. And of course, never to practice law again there because of the jury tampering related to that case. By the way, Willie J. Burns, I know we had a movie showing, Leonardo DiCaprio as Hoover, the first director of the FBI, but in fact, the first director of the FBI was Willie J. Burns. He only stayed about a year and a half. He couldn't stand the government bureaucracy, and he got out, and his understudy, a guy named J. Edgar Hoover, took over as head of the FBI. He went on to run his own detective agency. In fact, the William James J. Burns Detective Agency is still in business, I believe. Another example of the big thinking, look at this. Look at this St. Paul at the map of 1900. This is what St. Paul thought it would look like in 1900. This is the kind of planning they were doing during the Gilded Age or during this Titanic period. They saw St. Paul as a hub of a railroad system. But look where the railroad's going. It's going across the Atlantic. And not just one set of tracks, they were going to double track across the Atlantic, 2 sets of tracks. Big, big thinking. This is the time a few years before the Suez Canal had been built, which made us think it was possible to build the Panama Canal. In fact, the de Lesseps family who built the Suez thought that they could build the Panama. And unfortunately, that didn't work out that way. They went, their investors went broke several times over trying to build that. This is the time of great World's Fairs. This is the 1889 Universal Exposition in Paris, for which Eiffel built this tower. By the way, I think about 40 or 50 of the leading citizens in Paris wrote a joint letter to the government of Paris saying, this tower is ridiculous. We can't have it. It is just ridiculous. It won't happen. Eiffel built this at his own expense. And he figured, he's such a good engineer, he figured out how every piece of that would go together, how much would be deflected by its own weight, so that they pre-drilled all the rivet holes, put it together, and put the rivets in, and it all worked. Not over almost 1,000 feet tall. Of course, it's become the symbol of Paris. And those same people who wrote that letter later wrote a letter saying, you know what, we were wrong, which is pretty amazing in itself. And the Eiffel Tower has been a really popular feature of Paris ever since. But it was built for the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. In 1893, America said, you know what, we've got to address this. Paris just made us look bad. Our Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia wasn't anything to write home about. It was brick buildings, wasn't too inspiring. We've got to really put on a show. Let's celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World. Columbus, by the way, at this time in history was the most popular hero figure in America, except for George Washington. There are more streets, places, towns, whatever you can think of, named after Columbus than any other person in American history except George Washington. 100 years later, by 1992, we didn't want to know Columbus. We thought he was a bad guy. But in 1893, he was a hero. This is the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and it started the City Beautiful movement. It was an incredible exposition. The attendance was about equal to half of the population of the U.S. It was probably the 3rd most important event in American history, but it's not known today much. And Ferris somebody had to answer Eiffel's Tower, by the way. And eventually it was Gale Ferris who figured out, you know what, if he can build a 1,000-foot steel tower, maybe I can build a 300-foot tall steel thing that moves. And that's what he did. He invented this Ferris wheel, which I told you, or designed, I should say, which I told you had cars the size of rail cars and stood 265 feet tall and was run by two 2,000 horsepower steam engines. It was really something, and nobody, imagine seeing something like that for the first time in your life and taking a ride on it. You'd have to have a lot of faith in the engineers. Look at those tiny little spokes, you know, holding that whole thing together. This is the entrance to the 1900 Paris Exposition. So we were competing with Paris primarily, it seems. This was the entrance to our 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. The architects for this were the architects of Whitehall and the architects of the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine and the Alcazar in St. Augustine. The architects, by the way, that Flagler had given a chance to when they're in their very early 20s, just starting their career. He believed in them and gave them their first opportunity. This is the 1904 exposition in St. Louis. And again, you can see that the design of the Columbian Exposition really carried through all of the American expositions that followed. They were all these monumental buildings meant to say to the rest of the world and to ourselves that we were becoming a great Western culture, the greatest of all Western cultures, in fact. And of course, we all know at this time, Henry Flagler decided to build the Oversea Railroad, the most ambitious engineering feat ever undertaken by a private citizen. And amazingly, he accomplished it. Now, I know those of you who paid attention to Florida history probably think that Henry Flagler just sort of went to St. Augustine, liked it, built a hotel, that was nice, bought a couple of railroads, and sort of fiddled around until he got to Daytona, and then kind of worked his way to Palm Beach, and then one day decided he'd go to Key West. But the truth of the matter is, the second largest city in Florida was in Key West. 20,000 citizens, half of them Cuban, by the way. Cigar rolling was one of the biggest industries at this time. And it was, per capita, it was probably the wealthiest city in the country. So it wasn't this sort of marginal place where people painted their bodies to look like they were wearing clothes like they do these days. It was a going concern, and Flagler believed that getting a railhead there, so near what would be the Panama Canal eventually, made a lot of sense. So he announced construction in 1905, but in fact, he'd secured from the President of the Senate in 1891 concessions to make sure that he had the only charter to take a railroad to Key West. And the President of the Senate was willing to give him that concession because he didn't think anybody else could do it except Flagler. So you know if he was planning to do it in 1891, he didn't wake up one morning in 1891 and ask for an appointment with the President of the Senate. He'd been thinking about it for probably a couple years before that, which means probably before Henry Flagler ever left St. Augustine, he was planning to go all the way to Key West. In fact, Henry Flagler's vision was to really develop the Bahamas, Cuba, and the peninsula of Florida. So here's what a guy got paid to work on the railroad in those days, $1.50 a day, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. And by the way, this is the only handbill that survived from that period, which is in the Flagler Museum's collection. But to give you some sense of what this meant, a Secret Service agent at the same time in history was paid $3 a day. So when you look at it in that context, I think $1.50 doesn't sound so bad. And certainly Flagler was able to employ 4,000 laborers in building the Overseas Railroad at any one time. The railroad was built, and then the trick was there going to be a problem? Because remember I've told you all about all these bombings and the labor riots and so on going on at this time. Henry Flagler wasn't too sure that everybody thought this was going to be a good thing. So this is Engine 12, which was sent down ahead of him to Key West to make sure there were no bombs set along the track where the track wasn't sabotaged, so that he could then follow on in his private engine and car to Key West in 1912, the same year as the Titanic. This is him arriving. This is Engine 48 pulling his two private cars into Key West, where there were 10,000 people waiting to see him in a celebration that went on for a week. In fact, here he is being presented. You see the medallions in the upper left-hand corner? Those were commissioned by Tiffany & Company by the citizens of Key West in appreciation for Flagler building the railroad to Key West. And they were given to him on that day, and they are now part of the museum's collection. You can see them at the Flagler Museum today. His employees were so pleased with who they called Uncle Henry that they commissioned Tiffany & Company to make this beautiful silver with gold overlay box to contain this beautiful telegram. That's a solid sheet of 18-karat gold, a telegram of congratulations to him. And there were so many employees that wanted to contribute, they had to limit the amount you could contribute as an employee to no more than $5, but most contributed 50 cents to $1, and collectively they had more than enough money to have this beautiful object made, thanks to Henry. In fact, the rail car he rode to Key West, rail car 91, is in the museum's collection. We built a special building for it, so if you haven't come to see that, I hope you will. Remember I said his vision was for the Bahamas and Cuba as well? Well, he died before this actually was put into place, but his ultimate plan, which actually was implemented in 1914, was to have these special ferries made that could dock in Key West. You could roll your private car or a passenger car from the tracks right onto this ferry, stay in your seat as it went across the straits to Cuba, roll your car off this ferry onto the tracks in Cuba, and continue on your trip around Cuba. So you could go from New York to Havana without ever getting out of your rail car. Pretty amazing. Why would Henry do that? Well, he owned $250,000 worth of the Cuban railway system. He was no dummy. His vision was huge. And his vision, you might say, was Titanic. This was a period of really Titanic thinkers and doers. In fact, here's the rail station in Havana at the time. So, pretty amazing. So what happened during this period? This is the period of the Titanic, but we don't have the same kinds of things going on today. And what happened is, this Titanic version of America, is that World War I interrupted the labor struggle, and because we needed to produce mass materials for the war, Labor quieted down. We knew we needed a capitalist system to produce those materials, so capitalism was no longer under siege, at least during World War I. We wound up with Wilson as president, Professor Wilson. I think he was a Princeton professor before he became governor of New Jersey and then president of the country. And then he was followed by others like Hoover, the great engineer, and eventually by FDR. All of these men in the early 20th century believed from their experience in World War I in central planning and central management. In fact, they all came to admire a new form of government that had called itself the Soviet Union. In fact, FDR sent a shipload of people over to see the Soviet Union, people he trusted, advisors, to see how they did things because he admired what they seemed to be doing so much. And they saw themselves as not presidents, but planners in chief. They believed that they could basically manage the economy and manage production and manage just about everything you can think of. So it was an amazing time in our history that ended, really, with a speech that was given by FDR. It ended a couple of years. It really ended with the crash of the stock market in '29. But by 1932, we were in the depths of the Depression. FDR went out to San Francisco to give a speech to the Commerce Club, in which he said, the age of the Titan is over. And basically said, now it's up to the planners to take over the country. And things started to change. They started to change dramatically. Let's go back to these guys. So, back at the time of the Titanic, these were the two wealthiest men in the country, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Now, how wealthy do you think they were? I'll tell you how wealthy they were. The wealth of John D. Rockefeller was greater than the national budget in 1914. Okay? So imagine a citizen in America having wealth equal to 1 year's national budget in this country. How wealthy would they have to be today? They'd have to be worth about $3.5 trillion. You know anybody like that? No. No, in fact, the budget, once we went down the road of the government being the solution, not the leaders in business, not the leaders in society, the government could only grow. If government's the solution, it's going to grow. And it grew over the next 100 years. It doubled in size 12 times over the next 100 years. We talk about a second Gilded Age today because we think there are these really wealthy guys today. Well, Rockefeller, in real dollars, was 10 times wealthier than Bill Gates is today. Can you imagine that? That's real money. And when you think about that kind of wealth, it's maybe easier to think in Titanic terms, but that's certainly Titanic wealth. Rockefeller said, well, actually Andrew Carnegie said, who's pictured on the left, a man who dies rich dies disgraced, And Rockefeller said, a man should make all he can and give it all away. That was their view of the world. Go out and do everything you can possibly do, and then when you've made your success, turn around and do something just as big and bold as what you did to be successful. Give it away. In fact, the same men who created these giant corporations and made this incredible wealth during the age of the Titanic also created a whole other world. They created not just the for-profit corporate world, they created the non-profit corporate world that we all enjoy and benefit from so much today. In fact, let's go back to them for a second. There's no one of us that pays the real cost to get a university education, to go to a ballet or an opera or a symphony, or to visit a museum. Each of us pays only a fraction of cost for those educational cultural activities, and the bulk of those activities is still underwritten, even today, more than 100 years later, by the investments made by the same titans in industry who created the whole nonprofit world. One world, as Peter Cooper, our greatest philanthropist and businessman, said, one world to, as he said, the purpose of business is to make money. The other, and as he said, the purpose of life is to do good. This is a uniquely American perspective that grew out of laws the Tudor monarchs passed that then came over with our first immigrants to America and took root here in America like no other place in the world. And so today, we visit a museum like the Science Museum or the Flagler Museum, and we think when we pay, well, we must be paying what it costs. But in fact, the average cost to visit a museum is somewhere between $60 and $70 nationwide. Who pays that kind of interest admission? We don't. But who makes up the difference? Well, it comes from foundations established by these titans of America's Gilded Age, primarily. And we still have givers today, but they have a different perspective. So who are the two wealthiest men around today? Yeah, Gates and Buffett, right? So what are they saying to their colleagues? They're not saying if you die rich, you die disgraced, or make all you can and give it away. What they're saying is, you should give away at least half of what you make. And by the way, Bill Gates said just a few weeks ago, he thought it was sinful, or immoral actually is what he said, to give money to build a new wing in a museum when there were so many diseases to cure. And so since Warren Buffett has stepped aside and said, I don't really want to manage giving it away because, as Andrew Carnegie said, that was harder than making it. Figuring out how to give it away and actually make it do good was harder than making it. So he just said, I'll give it to Bill Gates and let him figure out how to give it away. And Bill Gates has focused his efforts outside of America and his philanthropy, for the most part, outside of America. So I hope I've convinced you that the world of the Titanic was indeed a Titanic world, and that we thought about things differently, that we did things differently, and that we struggled mightily to become who we are today as a country, and that we have benefited tremendously from the way these titans of business and commerce saw the world. And I would like to think that by knowing such things, we might tend to want to reproduce and perpetuate a great American tradition which has brought us so many good things. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. Are there any questions? There's a hand. I can actually see a hand.
You were saying that on the top of, is it the Washington Monument, that the aluminum is there, the aluminum cap,
Yeah.
with an inscription. What is the inscription? I remember hearing.
That's a great question. I ran across a picture of the cap by itself the other day, and I just couldn't make it large enough to read the inscription. It was the first time I actually knew that there was an inscription. I thought it had just been a plain piece of aluminum up to that point, but I'll have to do a little more research before I know.
I read about it, like a year ago, and now I can't remember.
And aluminum was a magic metal for these people. It didn't seem to rust. It conducted electricity. It was malleable. It was just sort of almost a magical kind of thing to them. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you for your attention and your time.
Thank you.